Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning to those of you who have joined us in person. It is a packed standing room only here. We're so delighted. We're also excited to see all of you who are joining us online from whatever time zone. Thank you very much. We know your time is busy, and thank you for choosing this session. So our session today is on a really important topic, which is how we understand and communicate the impact of open access. Understanding and communicating impact is critical to the sustainability of open access publishing models. And so we'd like to debate that. And so here joining me, I have a librarian and a publisher. So we're just going to do some quick introductions first. So Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself and briefly explain why this is relevant to your role?
Sure. My name is Sara Scheib, and I am the Director of Scholarly Impact at the University of Iowa Libraries. So my department is involved with scholarly communications, research data management, and then also we kind of have a role in research assessment. And so that is where we start to look pretty intensely at open access and the impact of open access on communicating the value of University of Iowa research to the world.
Thanks, Sarah. And now, Tricia, do you want to do the same?
Sharing a camera here. My name is Tricia Miller, and I am the Institutional Marketing Manager at Annual Reviews. We are practicing open access transformative model, but also my role is to engage more broadly with how open access impacts the larger community beyond the academic institution.
And lastly, my name is Tim Lloyd. I run a company called LibLynx that produces usage analytics, and I'm also a member of the Project Counter working group on open access and unpaywalled analytics. So let's dive in. So the structure for today's session is going to be a series of questions that we're going to explore. We don't have any slides, which should make it a bit easier. The 4 questions are: firstly, what is impact in the context of open access publishing? Secondly, what problems and gaps are we already experiencing? Third, what are the emerging solutions? And then fourth, what the future holds. We're going to aim to take about half an hour of this time, so there should be time for questions. And we're going to dive straight in. So the first question, looking at impact in the context of open access publishing. Sarah, what do libraries and their stakeholders want to know?
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to break this down into kind of in general, and then I'm going to break it down into the subscribe to open journals and the read and publish journals, which are a little bit different. So in general, libraries and their stakeholders want to know what impact this journal has on the scholarly publishing community in general, just the scientific community, the scholarly community. And then we're also concerned about, our stakeholders are concerned about compliance. We, at our campus, we have a lot of sponsored research. And a lot of that sponsored research comes with requirements for public access to the results of those research. So we need to know, are the publications resulting from our sponsored research, are those available to the public? So that's a really important question for us. Are we following through on what we say we're going to do? For subscribe to open journals, of course, the 2 other questions pertain as well, but we also want to know if is it being used in our campus community, and how is it being used? Do our faculty cite these journals in their own work? Do they use them in their classes? And then what is the comparison of the impact on the field in comparison to the closed access journals? How can we see that difference playing out? And then for read and publish journals, all of the same questions that I've already referenced apply, but we also want more article level data to show return on investment. So for journals with tokens or other limited forms of OA support, how do we decide which manuscripts to fund or not? That's a really difficult question. And we need data to drive those decisions.
Thanks, Sarah. So Tricia, what changes and challenges are publishers and data providers seeing around impact?
Yeah, there are quite a few, but the ones that I'll highlight today include an increase of unattributed usage and increase in overall global usage. And that includes engagement by those outside of the academic institution. So that kind of leads to some confusion or disagreement about what open access impact is in the greater community. So outside of the academic institution, should that usage be weighted the same? Does that really matter? And matter to who? And so we also need to consider that, like Sarah, her questions, there's lots of different data that's available, but we need to think about what is it that the data that we're using is just a small piece of the story that librarians have to tell to the wider audience. And so how is the information that we can provide to them going to impact the faculty, the students, and the administrators around them? So with all the data we have, which pieces are actually useful? And then to a smaller extent, the databases and search providers that are offering login opportunities and new technologies like GetFTR, are those helping our data, or are they creating new challenges around like privacy issues?
Thanks, Tricia. And then the question I'm going to tackle is, what role can Counter play in demonstrating open access impact? So when I think about impact in terms of usage analytics, so the questions that come to mind are who, where, what, when, how, and why. And actually, Counter's got quite a useful role to play in all of those. So the who, open access content obviously doesn't have a paywall, so the identity of a user or their organizational affiliation typically isn't known, unless they're registered an identity for other reasons like personalization. But it's possible to anonymously associate a significant minority of usage with a registered organizational IP address to determine a user's organizational affiliation. So this provides valuable insights into the communities engaging with open access content. On the where, IP addresses can also provide insights into the geographical source of usage, and particularly whether open access content is reaching more geographically diverse audiences. So for example, institutions with funding tied to a particular region, such as a state, might want to understand whether their publications are being accessed by the local community. And many institutions fund research specifically to ensure it's accessible to parts of the world that traditionally lack equitable access. In terms of what, well, Countermetrics already associate usage with a particular title or item of content. So that's giving you very granular insights into what's generating user engagement. And the data type field in Counter can also provide insights into the nature of the content. So is this an article? Is it a data set? Is it a dissertation? The when, well, Counter reports aggregate usage by month, so the underlying data can be broken down into much more detailed analysis if you wanted to see how it's accessed over time. How, Counter reports allow usage to be broken down by access type. So this could be gold open access, for example, or completely freely open, as well as access methods, so text, save versus data mining. You could also analyze events in other ways, such as mobile access or device type. And then why, which is typically the most valuable aspect of understanding access and impact, and the hardest to discern from a distance. But a lot of these clues that I've just talked about can allow you to piece together a really good sense of why did that user want to engage with that content in the first place. So we're going to move on to the next question. What problems and gaps are we already experiencing? And Tricia, how does our metadata need to change to account for transformative agreements?
Yeah, so in my role, I work with both KBART metadata and also the depositing metadata. And when we think about KBART metadata, or that's going into your knowledge base, we have to think that the open access documentation about why something is open doesn't just stop when the agreement is signed or when the grant comes through. Every person along the line needs to know why the content is open access and what kind of agreement that happens. It's not just, is it diamond open access? Is it hybrid? They need to know a little bit more information. So we need to have some change logs that integrate open access information, even if it's just a simple designation about where to find more information. And then actually, Tim and I were having a great conversation about how our depositing metadata can be a little bit more granular. Sure, we were talking about how, adding some taxonomies to, to the metadata can then help us to understand how open access content is used in terms of disciplinary nature.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that right now. Another aspect of problems and gaps is to what extent do existing metrics, how can they be adjusted or reframed for an open access audience? And when you look at Counter, it's worth, people often only encounter Counter in the context of paywalled access. It's worth recapping, how does Counter address an open access use case, a pure open access use case? So, Counter reports have been around for almost 20 years. First standard came out in 2003. The emergence of hybrid journals is what prompted the addition of a dedicated gold open access journal report. That was in 2013, so quite a while ago. That was part of release 4. And that was the first thing that enabled publishers to break out usage of open access journals that were accessed as part of a paywalled collection. And then from January 2019, release 5 added this access type attribute. So that allowed reports to identify the license under which content was accessed. And there were 3 available: controlled, open access gold, and open access delayed, which is when an embargo period disappears. Another one, free to read. And so this definition of gold open access explicitly recognized content that could be in hybrid or fully open access publications. So Counter already provides a framework for capturing relevant usage metrics and reporting by institution or non-attributed and by content. But there are a number of other interesting areas where we have scope to understand impact. I wouldn't characterize them as gaps in Counter, as standards naturally evolve to address new emerging trends, but there's certainly opportunities to build a better understanding of impact. So some examples that I'm actively exploring include impact in terms of the type of organizations that users are affiliated with. So say academic or corporate or a government. And it's one thing to have a list of 17,000 organizations, but if you can't find ways to filter through that, that can just be a morass to wade through. Or which sectors of the economy are engaging with content, say finance versus healthcare. The thing you just mentioned now, Tricia, impact in terms of subjects and topics. One of the, I think, challenges of Counter is that it either operates at a very aggregate level, things like a platform report, or it operates at a very granular level down at the title. And there's not much in between. And if you're talking about large volumes of usage, which in an open access environment often happens, you want something that allows you to mediate in between, and subjects and topics would be a really great way to do that. So you could filter for, show me the usage of materials related to marine engineering in certain parts of the world. And also impact in terms of the end result for funders. So did the funders achieve their funding goals? For example, if you wanted to enable greater access to certain regions of the world, or you're driving engagement from organizations traditionally excluded from access to this sort of research. So that sort of impact for the funders is important. Okay, back to our questions. Tricia, do you want to add anything about altmetrics?
Sure, yes. Altmetrics and dimensions, there are several other data platforms that we can use that tell us how content is used beyond the download. So understanding how content is communicated in policy to the general public, on social media where authors are collaborating. So those are other tools that we can use to show the engagement of content that also shows the impact of the journal.
So Sarah, what internal changes are required in libraries to support this sort of open access impact assessment?
That's a big question, and I'm gonna just touch on two of the big things that are kind of outside the scope of this talk, but I'm just gonna touch on them because leaving them is not an option. But it's a big shift in philosophy, obviously, from gatekeeping to positioning ourselves as publishing partners, and then the other basic question is, how do we fund this? You know, there's still a lot of resistance to using collection funds to pay for APCs, and that is a very real concern. We need to find more creative funding models for funding open access journals of the read and publish type. But with regard to impact metrics, I think the biggest shift is that we can't really rely on cost per use as the decision-making, as like the sole decision-making metric at the journal level, or citation counts. We can't rely on those at the article level. We need to use a whole suite of metrics to evaluate open access, both at the journal level, but also at the institutional level. I think departments and research groups are also very interested in their level of engagement with open access. So we need to find a way that we can measure that engagement. And then, of course, you know, at the author level, you know, if, you know, it only increases the incentive to publish open access if we can demonstrate to authors that their content, when it is published open access, has a broader reach and a more significant impact. So, and then of course at the article level, you know, one of the things that I'm interested in exploring, you know, of course, you know, we're all familiar with H-index and its association with author as an author level metric, but you can apply an H-index to any corpus of publications. And so, you know, it would be really interesting for us to apply that to evaluating the publications that we've funded and what kind of impact those are having. So yes, so all kinds of important questions about internal changes. Really, we're building the plane as we're flying it and learning as we go.
Very, very true. Okay, so we're going to turn to what are the emerging solutions now, and I'm going to start by just briefly summarizing how Counter is evolving to reflect a greater emphasis on open access usage. So Counter have signaled their intent to evolve the current code of practice, release 5, to provide better support for reporting on usage of open access content. The most recent update to release 5, which was issued just at the end of September, 5.0.2, added support for optional elements to break aggregate usage down by geolocation, and they're piggybacking on the existing ISO 3166 standard for country and subdivision names and codes. Counter are planning more significant changes for reporting open content in release 5.1, which is scheduled for consultation in mid-2022, which seemed a long time away. But it takes time for emerging practices to be identified and assessed before new best practices can be determined. So we should rightly expect the best practices to lag behind innovation in this area. So turning to you next. Actually, no, this one's me again. This is, what is the use and understanding of new platforms such as the Open Access Switchboard to support library administrators, authors, and funders? So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the OA Switchboard was founded in 2020. It's the aim of helping to manage the increasingly complex network of agreements between publishers and institutions. The complexity has been driven by a lot of factors. So we've got growth in the number of and diversity of open access business models, some with or without individual publication fees, some through agreements with publishers, some through sponsorship models. Funders and institutions are expanding their publication requirements. Those need to be tracked through the process, which is something that Sara alluded to earlier. We've got more complex relationships, so multiple authors, each with multiple institutional affiliations and funder arrangements. And then just a whole host of complex processes. Some are manual, some are automated, some are central, some are decentralized. There's inconsistent terminology, inconsistent use of identifiers. So the OA Switchboard's goal is to act as a neutral, independent intermediary, providing a shared infrastructure, standards, and back office services for funders, institutions, and publishers. And so they can participate directly via accounts with the OA Switchboard, and authors would benefit indirectly. Tricia, is it relevant to you?
It's actually not at this point. Annual Reviews is participating in a subscribe to open program, which has less of the intricacies of read and publish or publish and read deals. Nonetheless, even if there are less things to manage, it's still an open access publishing model. And we do hope that those of us who don't have APC open access models will be brought into the OA switchboard conversation.
Okay, we're going to turn to some of the meat of this discussion now. This is one for you, Sara. What systems are libraries using to track impact? And you have 5 minutes, because this you could spend an hour on, I know. Go.
All right, I'll try to keep this pretty high level. I'm gonna split this off into journal level, author level, and article level. So at the journal level, we at the University of Iowa, we're managing all of our transformative agreements through RightsLink from Copyright Clearance Center. And so, so we make extensive use of the reports that come out of RightsLink to get a handle on what we're actually doing and what publications are coming out of that. Alma Analytics, so the excellent counter data that we receive from our publishers, we analyze that in a number of ways. We're an ex libris shop, and so we use Alma Analytics, and that's been fairly effective. Although there are some hurdles there as well. JCR, Journal Citation Reports, excuse me. Love it or hate it, impact factor is still something that that authors and administrators pay attention to. And so it's important for us to include that in our analyses. But we're also starting to rely more and more on alternatives to impact factor, Scopus with their site score, and the source normalized impact factor that you can get through Scopus, and Dimensions and other tools as well. Dimensions is a tool that I haven't had a chance to dig into as much as I'd like, but I see a lot of potential there. They seem to really be leaning into the analytics side of large multidisciplinary citation database. So I think there's a lot of potential there. At the author level, SciVal and Scopus, those are two tools that we have available to us on our campus, but of course, Web of Science, Dimensions, those are other tools that can be used. We are an early adopter of Ex Libris Esploro. And so that provides us with some very interesting data as far as our authors, our researchers' publishing habits. And then Google Scholar, of course. Won't dive into that anymore. But then at the article level, of course, publisher sites are getting better and better. We're seeing more and more metrics on publisher sites. Of course, Web of Science, Scopus, and Dimensions are really useful at the article level. And but really, everything that I've talked about, with the exception of RightsLink and Alma Analytics, is based on citations. And so if we want to get outside of that scholarly bubble, altmetrics is really kind of the best game in town as for demonstrating impact outside of the academy.
So, okay, so we're now going to move to what the future holds. And one of the big questions, frankly, for the whole society over the last few years has been sustainability and equity. So Tricia,
Yes.
what needs to occur to make that happen effectively here?
So open access publishing is shifting from an opportunity to sell someone something to collaborative services. And so we need to think about when we communicate and engage and use our data to do that, how we're bringing in all the different stakeholders who are now part of the conversation that haven't been before. So when we think about the pathway to open access in practice, the benefit has to not just be for ourselves, the publisher, but to make sure that we're aligning with the stakeholders and the strategies of those that we're partnering with. And then we have to think about sustainability can mean lots of different things. And so we could spend all afternoon talking about standards of sustainability and equity. But I think we all agree that sustainability needs to mean financial transparency. We know that sustainability is equity and diversity in who can publish and who can access content. Sustainability is collaborative decision-making with our librarians, our publishers, our funders, and our authors. And also it can mean lots of different things, but it comes down to how we're communicating and how we're trying to forge a new pathway together. So the sustainability, regardless of how you see what it is, it means that we're all coming together to decide there are lots of different pathways that can lead to open access and what works best for you. And then the current challenges are becoming apparent that publishing models, all the stakeholders in open access don't necessarily even understand what open access is. So it's not just about open access, we're doing something that leads to open access. It's what is open access? What are we trying to accomplish, and keeping that in mind? So open access does not mean free access. Open access does not mean low quality publishing, but open access does mean that there's less restrictive copyright. It does mean that there's more collaboration. And things that we're working on right now that are sort of the immediate challenges are, how do our licensing agreements, our terms, our conditions, our legal jargon, how does that need to evolve, or does it, depending on what kind of pathway you're taking to open access? So to be sustainable, all of these things, understanding what sustainability is, understanding what open access is or isn't, and understanding how we communicate about transformative models or differing kinds of publishing models have to evolve with that, and who has to do
that. Thanks, Tricia. And Sara, how can we communicate more effectively to make open access initiatives work from an institutional perspective?
So it's about reframing the conversation, I think. OA publishing is about contributing to a more equitable and sustainable future for scholarly communication. And so, we're in the midst of, it's a paradigm shift. And there are multiple business models on the table. And so, we need to use creative ways of using metrics to measure the impact of these journals so that we can make informed decisions about the best way to move forward as a community. But at the same time, we need to be very careful about perpetuating some of the biases that are built into the system, and relying on things like citation counts, and that we know that those are biased, and so we need to be careful that we are balancing our need for metrics, our need for solid numbers, with the kind of qualitative measures that we've heard mentioned in other sessions here at Charleston.
Okay, thank you. So that is the end of the sort of questions we wanted to formally talk about. This has been one of the most challenging sessions I've ever been involved in, because you could do a whole conference about the impact of open access metrics, and picking, what were the issues we wanted to talk about between the three of us was really quite tough. So at this point, are there any questions? And maybe I'll check in the room here first to give you, Sarah, some chance to look through Pathable and see if there's some questions in there. So does anyone have any questions here they want to ask?
Well, as a collection development person, what resonated with me is that argument about whether collection funds should be used to help pay for APCs and other things. What conversations need to take place? And maybe that's a question for Sarah. And
yeah. I'll repeat that just to make sure everyone online gets it. So the question's about how should collection funds be used to fund APCs, and what conversations need to happen with institutions to either make that happen or determine whether it's appropriate. And do you want to take that one, Sarah?
Sure. I mean, I think there may be others in the room who have better answers for this question, because this is still very much an open question at our institution. It's something that we evaluate on a case-by-case basis, and the answer to that question varies from selector to selector. So I think. The subscribe to open model, I think that's a lot, I think it's a lot easier to justify that, that relationship, that funding model with subscribe to open, just because it's a proxy for our normal subscription costs. But I think there are a lot of folks who feel and are entirely justified in that feeling that collection funds should be used to provide access to materials that our patrons would not otherwise have access to. And so I think there's some interesting work happening. See, at the University of Minnesota, they have a new collection management or collection development policy. I don't know, a philosophy, I guess. And so I think that tries to toe a very delicate line there. And here at Iowa, we also have a new philosophy as well. So I think there's a lot of conversations happening around this issue, and I don't think there are solid answers as much as there are good discussions.
You hinted in your answer, Sarah, that this is on a case-by-case basis. So has it actually happened then?
Yes. So see, we have a read and publish, or I guess they call it a transitional agreement with the American Chemical Society, and so we have a certain number of tokens every year that we can use to help our authors to pay their APCs, and we publish a lot with ACS. And that was a decision that was made by an individual selector with me in support, and it's been a tremendously successful deal from the perspective of the authors. They love it. We're almost out of tokens for the year.
Tricia, do you know if in the case of annual reviews that some of your publications being funded from collection funds?
I actually don't know that, but Subscribe to Open, as we created it, is a little bit different because our authors are invited. And so the subscription model is to make sure that those who are invited still don't have to dip into any sort of, so annual reviews has never charged an APC or solicited the manuscripts. So we're trying to make that the same case, that no APC has to be presented to publish with us. But in terms of how we're getting the money from subscriptions, we're hoping will just continue on since the money was already in the budget, and so that it wouldn't have to dip into a separate collection to continue.
Any other questions from the room? So I had a question for you, Tricia.
Sure.
So if you could wave a magic wand and come up with a sort of impact report du jour that you'd love to be able to give to institutions like Sara's,
Yes.
what would be your number one thing you'd like to be able to tell people about or communicate?
I think what the number one thing we'd like to communicate is sort of an overview of how every journal has all the impact. So how many times it's been downloaded, but also how many times has it supported someone in the community, and how do you know that? How do you tell the story using the data? So if we're looking at altmetrics and we can see that it's been used in policy and a new law has been made because of something you've published, or at Iowa, if you can see that your authors were able to get a grant because it was cited so many more times because it was open, and we know that because of altmetrics or using dimensions. That's what we really want to show is, like, yes, the data is very important, but what else can we provide to our customers that they can tell a story about how they influenced the faculty and the students at their university.
And Sara, one of the reasons that it was particularly interesting to have you part of this panel was that you're in a department actually called the Office of Scholarly Impact? So why did your institution come to the decision to actually create a dedicated group to look at this?
Great question. So it was actually kind of something that happened by accident. So I was a sciences librarian at the time when this department was created, and I had been working in the scholarly communication space and the research data management space, but we also had on staff, we had a scholarly communications librarian and a data services librarian. And so at that point, those two people didn't have a department. They were just kind of off on their own, left to their own devices. And so we proposed the idea of creating a dedicated department that would really work with faculty and with graduate students, researchers, because open access, data management, it all gets to the core of, you want your work to have impact on the world. The world needs your research. And so we created this department, and it was kind of serendipitous. We've been in existence for about 3 years now, and we've since hired a data analyst to help us with the research assessment piece of all of this, and it's very exciting. There are two questions in the chat that I want to touch on with 1 minute left. So the first question is, should collection funds be used for subscribe to open models for books? I am not going to attempt to answer a should question. That is up to individual libraries and to make that decision. I think it's a strong model. I will say that. And then the second question is, Sara, how do you decide which articles to use the ACS tokens on? That's a great question that we are just exploring now. We're getting to the end of the year, and this was a partial year that we had the full amount of tokens. And so if we're already running out of tokens this year, we're definitely going to run out next year. And so far, we have just been approving everything that comes in, but we know that we can't do that going forward. And so we're assembling a group to take a look at that specific issue. And I would be happy to follow up with folks when we arrive at that decision.
Great, and that was marvelous time management. I think we're at the end of our 40 minutes, so I'd like to thank everyone for turning up online and in the room here, and enjoy the rest of your conference. There's not much left. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.